People who suddenly woke up in the hospital. What happened? I've always found it fascinating and terrifying to hear stories of people who suddenly wake up in a hospital bed, completely unaware of how they got there or what happened. Imagine the confusion. One moment, you're living your life as usual, and the next, your eyes open to sterile white walls, beeping machines, and nurses looking down at you, all while you have no clue how you ended up there. It's a frightening situation that, unfortunately, a lot of people have experienced. For me, it happened in the most unexpected way. I'd always been relatively healthy, no major issues to speak of. One night, I was just hanging out with some friends, watching a movie, nothing out of the ordinary. I remember feeling a little tired, but I brushed it off as a long day catching up to me. That's the last clear memory I have of that night. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in a hospital bed. My vision was blurry, my head was pounding, and I had no idea where I was. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but then I noticed my parents sitting by my side, looking worried. I asked, "What happened?" And their response shook me. Apparently, after I fell asleep at my friend's house, I started having seizures. My friends had no idea what was happening, and they panicked. They called an ambulance, and I was rushed to the hospital. I had no history of seizures, so waking up to that news was jarring. The doctors ran tests and determined that it was a one-off event, possibly triggered by extreme stress or exhaustion, but the memory gap, the feeling of losing control over my own body, and the realization that my life had taken such a sudden turn, it's something I'll never forget. I know my story is pretty mild compared to others, though. I've heard some wild stories of people waking up in hospitals, not knowing they've been in an accident or even a coma. A friend of mine shared his experience, which still blows my mind. He was out for a run one morning, training for a marathon, when suddenly everything went black. He woke up in a hospital room 2 days later with no memory of what happened. Turns out he had been hit by a car, and his injuries were severe enough that he had been in and out of consciousness for 2 days. The driver had fled the scene and the police were involved. My friend had no memory of the accident, the ambulance ride, or the first few hours in the hospital. His first memory was waking up to his family at his bedside, explaining what had happened. The scariest part for him wasn't just the physical pain or the fact that he had almost died. It was the mental fog, the feeling that his life had suddenly paused and he had missed the most important part of his own story. He had to rely on others to fill in the blanks. He told me it felt like he had gone from one moment to the next, skipping over the accident entirely. It left him shaken for a long time. And even though he's fully recovered now, he says the fear of waking up in a hospital again haunts him. There's also the story of a former coworker of mine who woke up in the hospital after what should have been a regular day at the office. He had been feeling tired for a few days, but nothing out of the ordinary. He chalked it up to overworking himself and planned to rest over the weekend. Well, Friday afternoon rolled around, and while he was typing away at his desk, he suddenly collapsed. One of his coworkers found him unconscious on the floor and immediately called an ambulance. He had suffered a heart attack, completely out of the blue, at 36 years old. When he woke up in the hospital, he had no memory of collapsing or being taken there. He said it felt like he had gone to sleep and woken up in a nightmare, only to realize it was real. The doctors told him he was lucky to be alive, and that his fast recovery was nothing short of a miracle. To this day, he says he's thankful for the quick actions of his coworker, who likely saved his life. But waking up in the hospital with no warning signs and no recollection of what had happened, it changed him. He's much more cautious about his health now, as you'd imagine, but the mental toll of that experience stuck with him for a long time. Then there are those who wake up after even longer periods of unconsciousness, like people who've been in medically induced comas. I can't even imagine what that's like. I once read a story about a guy who had been in a coma for 2 months after a severe car accident. He said waking up was like stepping into a different life. The world had moved on without him, and everything felt foreign. His family and friends had been visiting him daily, but he had no memory of it. He said the strangest part was trying to reconnect with the world, knowing that he had been gone for so long. The doctors told him he'd been talking, reacting to people, and even moving during his coma, but he didn't remember a single second of it. It was like his body was there, but his mind had checked out. There's another story I heard about someone waking up in the hospital after an overdose. She didn't remember taking anything, but was told she had overdosed on a mix of substances at a party. The most terrifying part for her was the fact that she couldn't trust her own memory. She had lost chunks of time and had no idea how she ended up in that hospital bed. She said waking up was the moment that changed her life. She sought help after that, but the fear of losing control like that again stayed with her for years. So, what about you? Have you ever had that disorienting moment of waking up in the hospital with no idea how you got there? What happened? How did you deal with the confusion and fear of trying to piece together the missing pieces of your life? I'm sure some of you have stories even crazier than the ones I've shared, and I'd love to hear them.